The Macabre case of the Smith twins' wild sexual practices, brother and sister who married each other. That's what a small farming town called Havenwood buried for decades, hidden behind church doors and family shame. When 28-year-old Anna returned home after 10 years away, she thought she was burying her mother, Martha, a woman who supposedly took her own life. But in a dusty attic chest, she found faded photographs that revealed an unspeakable truth. Her parents weren't just husband and wife, they were twins. Brother and sister bound by blood in a marriage that should never have been. The whole town knew, the pastor knew, the sheriff knew, and they all chose silence over salvation. But Anna discovered something even more horrifying. Her mother's death wasn't suicide. Someone wanted Martha's secrets buried forever. In a place where scripture was twisted into silence, how far would an entire community go to protect the unthinkable? The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning when the November frost still clung to the windows of Anna's small apartment above the city library, its yellow paper trembling between her fingers like a dying leaf. Martha Smith deceased, funeral arrangements pending. Return home immediately. Josiah, 28 years old, and she hadn't spoken to her parents in a decade. Hadn't even given them her address when she defled Havenwood with nothing but a suitcase and $17 in her coat pocket. Yet somehow, death had found a way to drag her back. The train journey stretched endlessly through barren farmland, each mile carrying her deeper into a past she'd worked so hard to bury. Havenwood appeared through the grimy window like a photograph left too long in sunlight, faded, yellowed at the edges, smaller than memory had painted it. The station platform was empty except for old Henry Morrison, his roomy eyes avoiding hers as he loaded her single bag into his rusted pickup truck. "Sorry about your ma," he mumbled, but his words carried the hollow ring of obligation rather than genuine sympathy. The silence that followed felt familiar, oppressive, like a wool blanket pulled too tight over her face. The Smith farm sat at the end of a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere else, its weathered clapboard house listing slightly to one side, as if the weight of secrets had finally begun to buckle its foundation. Paint peeled from the shutters in long accusatory strips, and the front porch sagged under the burden of decades of neglect. Anna stood in the driveway for a long moment, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air, before forcing herself to climb the familiar steps. Each creak of the wooden boards beneath her feet sounded like an accusation. Josiah opened the door before she could knock, his weathered face as impassive as carved stone. At 50-some, he'd grown thinner, more gaunt, his shoulders permanently hunched, as if carrying an invisible load. His pale blue eyes, the same color as her own, regarded her with neither warmth nor hostility, just a terrible, crushing indifference that made her stomach clench with old familiar dread. "You came," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. It wasn't quite a question, wasn't quite a statement. He stepped aside to let her enter, but the gesture felt more like resignation than welcome. The house smelled of dust and neglect, of meals eaten in silence and prayers whispered in dark corners. Nothing had changed. The same threadbare furniture, the same water-stained wallpaper, the same suffocating sense that joy had been systematically drained from these rooms like blood from a butchered animal. Anna moved through the familiar spaces like a ghost visiting her own past, her fingers trailing along surfaces that held the impressions of 1,000 small miseries. "Where is she?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Undertaker's," Josiah replied, settling into his chair by the cold fireplace. "Service is Thursday. Pastor Miller will speak." He folded his hands in his lap with the careful precision of a man accustomed to controlling every gesture, every word. Townfolk have been by, bringing food, paying respects. There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality that made Anna's skin crawl. She'd forgotten how he could make even mundane conversation feel like walking through a minefield. Over the next 2 days, Havenwood's residents arrived in steady processions, bearing casseroles and condolences in equal measure. Mrs. Henderson from the general store, her eyes darting nervously between Anna and Josiah, as she spoke in hushed tones about Martha S.'s troubled mind and peaceful passing. Pastor Miller himself, tall and austere, his presence filling the small parlor with the weight of moral authority as he spoke of God's mysterious ways and the importance of Christian acceptance. Each visitor brought the same carefully crafted sympathy, the same subtle suggestions that some things were better left unexamined, better left to divine judgment. But Anna had learned to read the spaces between words during her years away, and she heard what they weren't saying. She saw it in the way their eyes skittered away from direct contact and the nervous flutter of hands adjusting collars and straightening skirts and the too quick departures when conversation threatened to veer toward anything more substantial than the weather or crop yields. They were afraid not of her exactly, but of what her presence might stir up, what questions she might ask. Their fear hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and inescapable. Sleep came fitfully in her childhood bedroom, the narrow bed too short for her adult frame, the walls too close.
Ow.
Pressing in with memories she'd spent years trying to forget. On her third night, unable to bear the suffocating weight of the house any longer, Anna found herself climbing the narrow stairs to the attic, drawn by an impulse she couldn't quite name. The space was exactly as she remembered, low-beamed, dusty, filled with the detritus of lives lived in careful, crushing routine. Boxes of her mother's belongings sat stacked against one wall, their contents as mysterious to Anna as they'd always been. Martha had never been one for confidences, never one for sharing the interior landscape of her heart. It was wedged behind an old steamer trunk that Anna found the small wooden chest, its brass lock tarnished green with age. She'd seen it before, years ago. But her mother had always shooed her away with sharp words about private things and children who asked too many questions. Now, alone in the darkness, with only a bare bulb for illumination, Anna felt no such restrictions. The lock gave way easily to a screwdriver from Josiah's toolbox, metal shrieking against metal like a small wounded animal. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, lay a collection of photographs that made no sense at first. Children who looked identical except for their clothing. A boy and girl with the same pale eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, the same stubborn set to their jaws. At the bottom of the chest, tied with a faded blue ribbon, were letters written in her mother's careful script, that addressed to someone called My Dearest J. Anna's hands trembled as she unfolded the first page, her mother's words swimming before her eyes like accusations written in smoke. My beloved brother, the letter began. My husband, my sin, my salvation. The photographs fell from Anna's nerveless fingers, scattering across the dusty floorboards like accusations. Josiah and Martha as children posed, side by side with the easy intimacy of twins. Josiah and Martha as teenagers standing before the same church where Anna had been baptized, his hand on her waist, possessive and wrong. Josiah and Martha on their wedding day, their faces radiant with a joy that now seemed obscene, monstrous, impossible to reconcile with the cold. Silent people who had raised her. The truth settled over Anna like a burial shroud, heavy and suffocating and absolute. Her parents weren't just husband and wife, they were brother and sister, twins, bound by blood, and a love that violated every law of God and nature. The strange isolation of her childhood, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way the townspeople looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. It all made terrible, perfect sense now. She was the child of an abomination, the living proof of a sin so profound that an entire community had conspired to bury it in silence. Anna descended from the attic with the photographs clutched against her chest, her mother's letters crackling like dried leaves in her trembling hands. The house felt different now. Not just neglectful and cold, but actively malevolent, as if the walls themselves were complicit in the decades of deception. She found Josiah in the kitchen, methodically spooning cold beans from a can, his movements precise and economical as a man accustomed to eating alone. When she placed the photographs on the scarred wooden table between them, he didn't even glance up from his meal. His lack of surprise told her everything she needed to know. "You knew I would find them," Anna said, her voice steadier than she felt. The words hung in the air between them like an indictment. But Josiah continued eating with the same mechanical rhythm, each spoonful measured and deliberate. Only the slight tightening around his eyes betrayed any awareness of her presence. "All these years you knew someone would eventually look in that chest. You wanted me to find them?" Still nothing. The silence stretched taut as a wire, threatening to snap under the weight of 30 years of unspoken truths. When he finally looked up, his pale eyes held no shame, no guilt, only a terrible, implacable certainty that made Anna's skin crawl. "Your mother was weak," he said simply, as if commenting on the weather. "She couldn't bear the weight of God's plan for us. But you're different. You're stronger." Came back. He returned to his beans with the same methodical precision, dismissing her as if she were a child, asking foolish questions about adult matters. The casual cruelty of his response ignited something fierce and uncompromising in Anna's chest. She swept the photographs from the table, sending them scattering across the linoleum floor like accusations made manifest. "God's plan," she demanded, her voice rising despite herself. "You call this abomination God's plan? You call what you did to her, what you did to me, some kind of divine will?" But Josiah had already retreated into himself, building walls of silence that no amount of rage or pleading could breach. He finished his meal, rinsed his bowl in the sink, and walked out of the kitchen without another word, leaving Anna alone with the scattered remnants of her family's sins. The funeral service 2 days later felt like a carefully choreographed performance designed to bury truth alongside the dead. Pastor Miller spoke of Martha's gentle spirit and quiet faith, his words carefully scrubbed of any reference to the torment that had consumed her final years. The mourners, and they were few, nodded along with practiced solemnity, their faces masks of respectful grief that revealed nothing of the knowledge Anna now knew they all carried. She sat in the front pew beside Josiah, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that died whenever she turned her head, of the sidelong glances that held decades of carefully guarded secrets. After the service, as the small crowd dispersed with the unseemly haste of people eager to return to their normal lives, Anna began her campaign of questions. She cornered Mrs. Henderson outside the church, her voice pitched low but insistent. "How long have you known?" she asked, watching the older woman's face go pale beneath her powder. "About my parents? About what they were?" Mrs. Henderson's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before she clutched her purse tighter and hurried away, muttering something about respect for the dead and young people who didn't know when to leave well enough alone. The pattern repeated itself over the following days. Every inquiry was met with the same wall of silence, the same carefully constructed ignorance. The blacksmith claimed he'd never paid attention to gossip. The postmaster suddenly developed selective deafness whenever Anna approached. Even the children seemed to sense the adult conspiracy, falling silent whenever she passed, their eyes following her with the weary fascination reserved for dangerous things. Havenwood had closed ranks around its secret with the efficiency of a military operation, presenting a united front against any attempt at excavation. It was Dr. Eli who finally broke the silence, appearing at her door on a gray Thursday afternoon with the furtive manner of a man about to commit treason. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the particular weariness of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. "I knew your mother," he said without preamble, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting to be overheard. "She came to see me near the end." He carried with him a leather satchel that seemed to weigh more than its contents should, and when he opened it, Anna understood why. Inside were 3 slim journals bound in faded cloth, their pages filled with her mother's precise handwriting. "She asked me to keep these safe," Dr. Eli explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said if anything happened to her, someone should know the truth. Not the town's version of the truth, but what really happened in that house." His hand shook slightly as he passed the journals to Anna, and she could see the cost this small act of defiance was exacting from him. "I should have done something sooner, should have spoken up when she was still alive. But this town," he trailed off, shaking his head, as if words were insufficient to describe the web of complicity that had trapped them all. The journals were a revelation and a horror. Martha's words painted a picture of a woman slowly drowning in shame and self-loathing, trapped in a marriage that violated every principle she'd been raised to hold sacred. She wrote of Josiah's growing violence, his increasing paranoia about discovery, his twisted interpretations of Scripture that cast their union as divinely ordained rather than fundamentally corrupt. But more disturbing still were her references to others who knew, Sheriff Coleman, who dismissed her pleas for help with lectures about family loyalty, Pastor Miller, who'd counseled acceptance and submission rather than escape, even Dr. Eli himself, who'd prescribed laudanum for her nerves rather than addressing their source. She was going to leave him, Dr. Eli said quietly as Anna read through the final entries. Dated just weeks before Martha's death, she'd been planning it for months, had money saved, train tickets purchased. She was going to disappear one night, start over somewhere no one knew her story. His voice cracked slightly. "She came to see me the day before she died, said she couldn't live with the sin anymore, couldn't bear knowing what they'd brought into the world." The implication hung heavy between them that Anna herself had been the final weight that tipped her mother toward despair. But the last entry in Martha's journal told a different story entirely. Written in a shaking hand that bore little resemblance to her usual careful script, it spoke of threats, of someone who knew about her plans and intended to stop her. "He says I can never leave." The entry read, "Says the town won't let me destroy what they've worked so hard to protect. Says there are other ways to ensure my silence if I won't choose it myself." The words were barely legible, as if Martha's hand had been guided by terror rather than intention. Dr. Eli's face was gray as ash when Anna looked up from the journal. "She didn't kill herself," he said, the words falling between them like stones thrown into still water. "Someone wanted her silenced permanently, someone who knew she was planning to expose everything." The terrible logic of it settled over Anna like a shroud. Her mother's death hadn't been suicide born of despair. It had been murder carefully orchestrated to look like the tragic end of a troubled woman. And everyone in Havenwood, from the sheriff to the pastor to the doctor sitting across from her, had been complicit in selling that lie to the world. Armed with her mother's journals and Dr. Eli's reluctant confession, Anna began a methodical excavation of Havenwood's carefully buried sins. She started at the county records office, a musty building that smelled of old paper and older secrets, where a nervous clerk named Patricia Morse guided her through decades of death certificates with the reluctant efficiency of someone accustomed to questions that shouldn't be asked. What Anna found in those yellowed documents painted a disturbing pattern. Too many women dying young. Too many deaths ruled accidents or suicides with minimal investigation. Too many families whose grief was quickly hushed and whose questions were discouraged by men in positions of authority. The official report of Martha S. death was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation signed by Sheriff Coleman and countersigned by the county coroner. A man Anna discovered had been Coleman's brother-in-law for 23 years. Cause of death, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Time of death, approximately midnight. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone else had been present in the farmhouse that night. But Anna had learned to read between the lines during her years as a librarian. The report's very perfection seemed suspicious. Real suicides were messy, complicated things that left questions and loose ends. This death had been scrubbed clean of inconvenient details with surgical precision. She began haunting the town's edges, seeking out the people who existed on the margins of Havenwood's respectable society, the drifters, the drunks, the women whose reputations had been sacrificed to protect more prominent men. In the shadowy corners of Murphy's Tavern, she found whispers of other stories. Other women who'd asked too many questions or threatened to expose too many secrets. Sarah Mitchell, who drowned in the creek behind her house after claiming Sheriff Coleman had forced himself on her. Rebecca Holmes, who died in a house fire just days before she was scheduled to testify in a land dispute involving Pastor Miller's family. The pattern was there for anyone brave enough to see it, a systematic elimination of inconvenient voices disguised as tragic accidents. Her investigation was not conducted in secret. Anna made no attempt to hide her activities. Havenwood responded to her probing with the coordinated hostility of an organism protecting itself from infection. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Doors that had once opened readily now remained firmly closed. The few shopkeepers who still served her did so with the grim efficiency of people fulfilling an unpleasant obligation, their eyes never quite meeting hers, their voices carefully stripped of any warmth or familiarity. She had become a pariah in the place of her birth, marked as dangerous, not for what she had done, but for what she might discover. The first anonymous threat arrived on a Tuesday morning, nailed to her front door with the crude efficiency of a medieval proclamation. "Stop digging or join your mother," it read, the letters cut from newspaper headlines and pasted onto brown paper with the careful precision someone accustomed to concealing their identity. Anna found herself scanning the faces of her neighbors with new eyes, wondering which of them had crept through the darkness to deliver this message, which of them knew enough about her activities to feel threatened by them. The warnings escalated with each passing day. A dead cat appeared on her doorstep, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, its glassy eyes staring accusingly up at her. Windows were broken in the middle of the night, the glass scattered across her bedroom floor like crystalline promises of violence to come. Someone cut the telephone lines to the house, leaving her isolated and vulnerable in a way that felt intentional, calculated to break her nerve. But instead of retreating, Anna felt her resolve hardening into something approaching obsession. Each threat only confirmed what she already suspected, that her mother's murder was not an isolated act of violence, but part of a larger pattern of corruption that extended to the very heart of Havenwood's power structure. Dr. Eli had grown increasingly nervous as Anna's investigation progressed. His visits becoming furtive, apologetic affairs conducted in whispers and shadowed corners. "You need to be careful," he warned during one late-night conversation in his office, his hand shaking as he poured whiskey from a bottle he kept hidden behind his medical texts. "Sheriff Coleman came by yesterday, asked a lot of questions about my relationship with your family, about what records I might have kept." The implication was clear. Anna's allies were being systematically intimidated, pressured to withdraw their support and leave her isolated and vulnerable. It was during one of these increasingly desperate searches for allies that Anna encountered Thomas Brennan, a weathered man in his 60s, who'd spent most of his adult life drifting from farm to farm, picking up work where he could find it. She found him loading supplies at the feed store, his movements careful and deliberate, despite the alcohol she could smell on his breath, even in the morning air. When she mentioned the Smith farm, his entire body went rigid with fear, his eyes darting around the store as if expecting to be overheard. "I worked there," he admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, before you were born. Saw things no man should see. Heard things that still wake me up at night." Thomas agreed to meet her at the abandoned Miller homestead 2 miles outside town, a place where their conversation wouldn't be observed or reported back to interested parties. What he told her there, seated on the rotting porch of a house that had stood empty for 15 years, confirmed Anna's worst suspicions about the true nature of her parents' relationship. He'd witnessed Josiah's rages, The way he de-striked Martha with the calculated precision of someone who knew exactly how to hurt without leaving marks that would invite questions. He'd seen her mother's desperate attempts to seek help, her tearful conversations with Pastor Miller that always ended with lectures about wifely submission and Christian forgiveness. She tried to leave once, Thomas said, his voice thick with memory and regret. Packed a bag, had me drive her to the train station in the next county, but they brought her back before the evening train arrived. Sheriff Coleman himself said there had been a misunderstanding, that she wasn't well and needed to be with family. The old man's hands trembled as he described Martha's return, her face bruised and her spirit broken, her eyes holding the particular despair of someone who'd glimpsed freedom only to have it snatched away. After that, she never tried again, just got quieter and quieter, like she was disappearing piece by piece. But Thomas's testimony came at a terrible cost. Within 2 days of their meeting, word had spread throughout Havenwood that the old drunk was spreading lies about respectable families, stirring up trouble with wild stories designed to blackmail honest people. His meager possessions were loaded onto a truck by men Anna didn't recognize, and Thomas himself was escorted to the county line with instructions never to return. When Anna tried to reach him through contacts in neighboring towns, she was told he'd simply vanished, disappeared into the anonymity of the road like so many inconvenient witnesses before him. Sheriff Coleman's visit to the Smith farmhouse came that same evening, his official sedan pulling into the driveway with the deliberate authority of law enforcement on important business. Anna watched from the kitchen window as he spoke with Josiah on the front porch, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but clearly serious in nature. When Josiah returned to the house, his expression was grimmer than usual, his eyes holding a cold satisfaction that made Anna's skin crawl. "Investigation's closed," he announced without preamble. "Sheriff says there's no evidence of foul play in your mother's death. Case is officially resolved." The finality in his voice was absolute, a door slamming shut on any hope of official justice. The walls of the Smith farmhouse seemed to close in around Anna with each passing day, the weight of decades of secrets pressing down on her like earth filling a grave. Sleep became a stranger, chased away by the endless replay of her mother's final journal entries and the haunting knowledge that Martha S. Killer walked free among Havenwood streets, protected by a conspiracy of silence that reached into every corner of the community. Anna found herself pacing the narrow hallways at all hours, her footsteps echoing through rooms that felt more like a tomb than a home, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of the horrors these walls had witnessed and concealed. Isolation was absolute and suffocating. Former neighbors crossed the street rather than acknowledge her presence, their faces turning away with the practiced ease of people who learned to see only what was convenient. The general store refused her business, citing vague concerns about inventory shortages that somehow never affected other customers. Even the postal service seemed complicit in her exile. Letters she'd written to journalists and law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties were returned unopened, marked undeliverable despite addresses she'd copied directly from official directories. Havenwood had sealed itself around her like scar tissue, cutting off her access to the outside world with surgical precision. Dr. Eli's capitulation came on a rain-soaked Wednesday that seemed to weep for the death of hope itself. She found him in his office, packing his medical supplies with the mechanical efficiency of a man in retreat. His hands shook as he avoided her eyes, and when she demanded an explanation, his voice cracked like that of a much older man. "They gave me a choice," he said, his words barely audible above the drumming of rain against the windows. "Close my practice and leave town, or face charges for improper disposal of medical records." Seems someone reported that I'd been sharing confidential patient information with unauthorized parties. The irony was bitter. The very act of helping Anna seek justice for her mother had been twisted into a crime against the community that enabled her murder. "They offered to let me stay if I signed a statement," Dr. Eli continued, producing a typewritten document from his coat pocket with trembling fingers. "Says I made an error in my assessment of your mother's mental state, that I may have inadvertently encouraged delusions about her marriage and family relationships. Says I deeply regret any confusion my unprofessional conduct may have caused. The paper felt obscene in Anna's hands. Each carefully crafted lie a betrayal of everything she'd fought to uncover. I can't fight them anymore, he whispered, his voice breaking entirely. I have children to think about, a wife who depends on my income. I'm sorry, damn sorry, but I can't be the man your mother needed me to be. With Dr. Eli's departure, Anna's last ally vanished like smoke, leaving her alone to face the growing hostility of a town determined to bury its sins, along with anyone brave enough to excavate them. The anonymous threats escalated beyond mere warnings into acts of deliberate psychological warfare. Her mother's grave was defaced, the simple headstone cracked down the middle with a sledgehammer. The flowers Anna had placed there scattered and trampled into the mud. Someone broke into the house while she slept, rearranging furniture and personal belongings in subtle but unmistakable ways that left her questioning her own sanity. Books were moved from shelves, photographs turned face down. Her mother's journals hidden in different locations each morning, as if the dead woman herself was trying to escape the scrutiny of her daughter's investigation. The relentless pressure began to crack something fundamental in Anna's psyche. She found herself talking to empty rooms, carrying on conversations with her mother's ghost, pleading for guidance that never came. Her appearance deteriorated as she forgot to eat regular meals or change her clothes. Her reflection in the mirror showing a wild-eyed woman who bore little resemblance to the composed librarian who arrived in Havenwood. Just weeks earlier. Sleep, when it came, brought nightmares of twisted family trees and burning houses, of her mother's voice calling out warnings that dissolved into meaningless whispers before Anna could understand their message. It was in this state of barely controlled desperation that Anna finally confronted Josiah, cornering him in the barn where he'd been repairing harness leather with the same methodical precision that characterized everything he did. The smell of oil and old hay surrounded them as she spread her evidence before him like cards in a losing poker hand. The photographs, the journals, Thomas Brennan's testimony, even Dr. Eli's reluctant confirmations of Martha's final days. "I know what you are," she said, her voice rough from weeks of sleepless nights. "I know what you did to her, what this whole damn town helped you do. I have proof of all of it." Josiah examined each piece of evidence with the dispassionate interest of a man reviewing his grocery list, his pale eyes betraying no emotion beyond mild curiosity. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the terrible certainty of absolute conviction. "Your mother was a weak woman," he said, his tone suggesting he was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "She couldn't accept God's plan for our family, couldn't understand that what we shared was sacred, ordained from the moment we drew breath in our mother's womb. The Lord works in mysterious ways, child. He brought us together not in spite of our blood connection, but because of it. We were chosen to create something pure, something untainted by the corruption of the outside world." The casual blasphemy of his words hit Anna like physical blows. Each twisted justification, another nail in the coffin of her sanity. "You raped your own sister," she whispered. But Josiah shook his head with the patience of a Sunday school teacher correcting a theological error. "Martha was my wife first, my sister second. The paperwork might say different, but God's law supersedes man's law, and God blessed our union with fertility and purpose. You are living proof of that blessing, child. You are the fruit of perfect love, untainted by outside influence or corrupting blood." His smile was beatific, terrifying in its absolute sincerity. Anna's carefully constructed arguments crumbled in the face of his unshakable delusion. She produced Martha's journal entries detailing years of abuse, but Josiah dismissed them as the fevered imaginings of a mind corrupted by worldly influences. She described the evidence of murder, the suspicious circumstances of Martha's death. But he spoke instead of divine justice and the Lord's way of calling his faithful home when their earthly trials became too great to bear. Every fact she presented was absorbed into his twisted worldview and reinterpreted through the lens of religious fanaticism until truth itself became meaningless. The town protects us because they understand God's will, Josiah continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon delivered to a congregation of one. They know that some things are too sacred for ordinary minds to comprehend, that sometimes the Lord's chosen must walk paths that seem strange to lesser souls. Your mother couldn't bear the weight of that calling, but you can. You're stronger. You came back to us when the Lord called, just as I knew you would. The implication in his words was clear. He expected her to accept her role in his grotesque family structure, to embrace the same twisted destiny that had destroyed her mother. As Anna stared into her father's pale eyes, seeing nothing but serene madness reflected back at her, she felt the last of her rational world collapse into fragments. Everything she'd believed about truth and justice, about the possibility of accountability in a corrupt world, crumbled like ancient paper exposed to flame. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, trapped in a nightmare where the monsters wore human faces and spoke of God's love while committing unspeakable sins. The pursuit of justice hadn't led to redemption. It had led only to her own destruction, her own descent into the same hopeless darkness that had consumed her mother before her. The decision to leave came not with fanfare, but with the quiet exhaustion of a woman who had fought against an immovable mountain until her hands bled and her spirit fractured. Anna packed her few belongings with mechanical precision, each item folded and placed in her suitcase like artifacts from an archaeological dig of her own destruction. The house seemed to exhale with relief as she moved through its rooms, as if the very walls were eager to expel the last witness to their shameful secrets. Josiah watched from his chair by the cold fireplace, his pale eyes tracking her movements with the satisfaction of a chess player who had anticipated every possible move and countered them all. He said nothing as she prepared to abandon the field of battle, but his silence spoke volumes about his certainty that the truth would die with her departure. It was in her mother's bedroom, that shrine to suffocated dreams and swallowed screams, that something fundamental shifted within Anna's wounded psyche. She sat on the narrow bed where Martha had spent her final nights, surrounded by the sparse possessions of a woman who had owned nothing that could truly be called her own. The morning light filtered through curtains that had hung unchanged for 20 years, casting everything in the sepia tones of old photographs. In that golden stillness, Anna felt her mother's presence, not as a ghost crying out for vengeance, but as a woman who had simply wanted her story to be heard, her suffering to be acknowledged, her existence to matter in a world that had conspired to erase her. The realization struck Anna with the force of revelation. She had been seeking the wrong kind of justice. The courts would never prosecute Josiah for crimes they refused to recognize. The sheriff would never investigate murders disguised as suicides. The town would never confess to decades of complicity in unspeakable sins. But truth itself was a kind of justice, and truth could not be buried as easily as bodies, or burned as thoroughly as inconvenient documents. Martha's story deserved to be told, not for the satisfaction of revenge, but for the simple dignity of acknowledgement. Anna spent her final week in Havenwood, writing with the focused intensity of a woman possessed. She commandeered the kitchen table, spreading her mother's journals, the photographs, Dr. Eli's reluctant testimony, and Thomas Brennan's eyewitness accounts across its scarred surface like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Her narrative took shape slowly, methodically, each paragraph crafted with the precision of someone who understood this might be the only chance for truth to see daylight. She named names without hesitation. Josiah's crimes, Sheriff Coleman's cover-ups, Pastor Miller's willful blindness, the town's collective conspiracy of silence that had enabled decades of abuse and murder. The letter she composed was not a plea for help or a cry for justice, but a testament, a historical record that could not be disputed or dismissed. She documented the pattern of suspicious deaths, the systematic intimidation of witnesses, the corruption that ran through Havenwood's power structure like poison in a well. Most importantly, She told Martha's story not as a cautionary tale or a victim's lament, but as the biography of a woman who had tried to survive impossible circumstances with whatever dignity she could. Salvage from her circumstances. Research through old newspapers in the county library had revealed the perfect recipient for her testament. Marcus Webb, a journalist with the state capital's largest newspaper, who had built his reputation on exposing small-town corruption and giving voice to stories the powerful preferred to keep buried. Webb had broken the scandal of the county judge who'd been taking bribes, had exposed the sheriff who'd been running protection rackets for bootleggers, had even brought down a state legislator who'd been embezzling funds meant for rural schools. If anyone would have the courage and platform to tell Martha's story, it would be him. Anna mailed her letter on a Tuesday morning, walking to the post office with the measured pace of someone completing a sacred ritual. The postal clerk, Mrs. Patterson, accepted the thick envelope with the same studied indifference she'd shown Anna for weeks. But something in her eyes suggested she understood the weight of what was being sent into the world. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by afternoon half of Havenwood knew that Anna Smith had mailed something substantial to someone outside their insular community. The tension in the air was palpable. A collective holding of breath by people who suddenly realized their carefully constructed house of cards might be about to collapse. The final act of defiance came in the pre-dawn darkness of her last morning in Havenwood. Anna walked through streets she'd known since childhood. Past houses where neighbors had once welcomed her with genuine warmth before fear transformed them into strangers. The church stood at the center of town like a white sepulchre, steeple reaching toward heaven while its congregation harbored sins that would have made devils blush. She pinned her letter to the heavy oak doors with the same nails that had been used to threaten her, the sound echoing through the empty streets like gunshots in a cathedral. By the time the sun rose over Havenwood, Anna was already on the eastbound train, watching the town shrink into the distance until it disappeared entirely behind rolling hills and morning mist. She felt no satisfaction in her departure, no sense of victory or vindication. Instead, there was only a profound exhaustion mixed with something that might have been peace. The peace that comes from completing a necessary task, regardless of its ultimate outcome. The article appeared in the state capital's newspaper 6 weeks later, spread across 3 full pages with the headline, "The Buried Sins of Havenwood, a Town's Conspiracy of Silence." Marcus Webb had done his job well, corroborating Anna's accounts with additional research, interviewing former residents who'd fled the town under suspicious circumstances, even uncovering financial records that showed patterns of payoffs and cover-ups dating back decades. The story caused a sensation throughout the state, generating demands for investigations and reforms that would ultimately come to nothing concrete, but would ensure that Havenwood's carefully maintained facade could never be fully restored. Anna read the article in her small apartment in a city 3 states away, where she found work in another library among people who knew nothing of her history or the price she paid to reclaim it. There would be no arrests, no trials, no dramatic confrontations between good and evil. Josiah would continue his twisted existence in the farmhouse where he'd committed his crimes, protected by statute of limitations, and a legal system that preferred not to examine certain uncomfortable truths too closely. But the silence had been broken, the secret exposed to daylight, and sometimes that was justice enough. Years later, Anna would return once more to Havenwood to find the Smith farm abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its fields returned to weeds. Josiah had died alone, and with his death, the last direct link to the town's shameful secret had been severed, but the story lived on, passed down in whispers and newspaper clippings, a permanent stain on Havenwood's reputation that would never entirely fade. For Anna, that was enough. Not the justice she had originally sought, but the justice her mother deserved. The simple acknowledgement that she had lived, suffered, and ultimately been heard,